that we did last week, the toy application that saves student names and grades. And we're going to swap out the backend. So instead of writing to files, we'll write everything into a MySQL database. So we're going to combine the stuff that we did in MySQL at the beginning of the semester, or the first half, and we're going to use PHP to connect and write to a database. Okay, so the first things that we need to do, when writing to files, it's a bit different. You can just come up with structure on the fly and encode it as you write it. When you want to write to a database, there's a bit of setup work beforehand. So I have to create the database, I have to create a user that can access the database, and I have to create a table with defined structure that I want to write to. So let's do that first. So you're probably more familiar with the command line version of MySQL, but we can also use PHP MyAdmin. So I think Mazir may have gone over this in lecture. The way I can reach it is if you're running XAMPP localhost /PHP MyAdmin. So it's just a graphical interface for MySQL. Okay, so it'll show me the SQL commands that I run by executing the commands. So let's say I wanted to create a new database. So we'll call this one wk14. And the collation, usually I like to use UTF-8. It's just the encoding. So let's look for UTF-8, general CI. Okay, so I've created database wk14. Here it is, wk14. And now what I can do is I can create a table. So we did this with the command line beforehand, create table, and then a bunch of values. So I'm going to create a table called students. Is that better? I'm going to create a table called students. The number of columns in the students. So last week we saved first name, last name, and grade. And we also used the index of the student in the array as a sort of ID, a unique identifier for the student. So instead of using the order in the table that it is, we're just going to add one more field to this table called ID. That'll serve as a unique identifier for the students. As a primary key, exactly. So instead of just 3 columns, we'll have 4. Okay? Good. So now, yes. Okay, it's okay. I'll take a look at this after. Okay, thanks. Okay, so let me zoom out a little bit. So here I'm just defining the columns inside my table. This will be easier to see. Okay, so the first column or field that I want to have inside the table is going to be ID. It's going to be of type integer. And what I want to do is I never want to write to it directly. I just want to have auto increment values. So it'll start at 1, and every time I make a write to the database, the ID will increment by 1. Okay, and then I also wanted to store first name. This first name was a variable length character. Let's say we want to give it a length of 45. We stored last name. Variable length character. Also 45 characters long. And grade, last week I think we just assumed it was an integer, but maybe we want to have some decimal values. So like 45.55. Yes. Sorry?
I just wanted to know how you created more fields, more rows.
How I created more rows?
As in, for all my screen, I only had like ID, so only the first row.
Okay, so there's a add something columns.
Right. But you only added 1, right? But you're able to add more.
No, I'll show you one more time. When I create the table, it said table name and how many columns. So I put 4 there.
Oh, okay.
I'll show you once again after I create this one. So ID, first name, last name, and grade. So for grade, we'll do decimal. And how many characters? Maybe 4 with 2 characters of precision. So I can get something like 99.99, for example. Okay? So none of them can be null. I didn't select null for any of them. I'll click save. And here's my students table. So let's, someone asked, how can I create a table with more rows? Let's go to new. Oh, this one does it automatically. Let's go to week 14. If I want to create a table, here it is. The name of the table and the number of columns. So if I put 10 here and do test, and I click go, I'll get 10 columns.
Can you go back to the one that you created?
Yes, the one that I created.
Yeah.
Let's go. Yes.
You could run this on your local hostings.
Yes.
On XAMPP.
Yes. 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 This is included in XAMPP. So can I go back to the one I just created? Here it is. So I have ID, which is an integer. which is the primary key, first name, last name, grade, and these are the variable types. Decimal 42. Okay, so that's the first steps. Now what I need to do is I need to be able to log into this database with some credentials. So if you remember, we did grant privileges on database. So we can do that here by clicking on the database we'd like to grant privileges for. Go to the privileges tab. We're going to click on privileges. And here we're going to add a user. So new, add a user. And here I can come up with any username you like. So sometimes we make users based on databases. So for example, I might call this database name user, like wk14 user. Or if you have, I don't know, some store that you're working for, store user. But let's just use my name for this one. Where am I going to be connecting from? Localhost. So I'm running the database on the same computer as I'm running my Apache server. So they're connecting through localhost. And my password. I'm just going to write the word password. Password. And then the important part is here. So grant all privileges on database wk14. This is the one that I want to be selected. You can grant privileges on other database if you like, but all you need for this exercise is wk14. So we're going to click go at the bottom here. Here's the SQL that's generated. If you'd like to copy that and run it somewhere else later, you can. Good. So I've created a database. I've created a table in the database. I've defined some structure. I've created a user that can log into the database. Let's add some sample students to my table so that when we read from it for the first time, we can see if it's working. So I'm going to go to insert. So here I'm going to put in 2 students, John Doe with a 77.5. And let's do Jane Doe with, I don't know, 75.5. Yes?
Can you show again where you put the privileges?
Yes.
Can you find them?
Yes, I can. So I just want to point something out before I continue. So notice, I'm not writing anything into the ID values. So when I set them as auto increment, that means I don't have to write to them every time I do an insert. You just write a null or don't write anything. And MySQL keeps track of the last ID used, and it just increments the ID.
As in 0, 1, 2?
Yeah, it starts with 1 though. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and it goes up. So if notice they're empty, and if I press go to write these values, if you look at the SQL that's generated, I'm writing to the values ID, first name, last name, grade. And for ID, I'm always writing null. Okay, and if I go back to my table, you see it auto increments the ID, 1 and 2. Okay, I was asked to go back to privileges. So here's the privileges tab where I add users. Is there anything specific you wanted to see with this tab? So it's up here.
Yeah, it's not showing the tab.
You click, what did you
Oh, it's not
click?
showing?
You click
Okay,
students, right?
click on wk14. Privileges. Should be after operations.
Yeah. So you don't click the table, you click the
subfolder
database.
Yes,
Okay.
database. Yeah. Okay. So any questions about the database setup? This should all be familiar. Yes? You don't have privileges on yours. Click on the database first. So the database name. You should see privileges. Okay. All right. So we've created everything we need to access the database. Let's go back to our code. So I'm just going to remind you what we did last week. So last week we read and wrote all of the student information to files. So I'm just going to go over a standard request one more time to remind you of the process. So we loaded the page. The first thing we did was we called GetStudents, which is a function. If we scroll up, GetStudents, what it does is it reads from a file that we've defined, stu-file, studentlist.txt, and it reads each line, or line by line, and separates all the lines read by the delimiter 3 pipes, and writes them to a global students array. Okay, once we've called GetStudents, we call process request. Process request, what it does is it checks to see if the user wants to add a new student, clear all of the students, or remove a specific student. So these are the conditions that we checked. Okay, and if we're adding a student, what we did was we added the student to the global array of students, and then called a function called append student. Append student, what it did is just wrote, here's append student. What it did is it opened the file for appending. That means we're writing to the bottom of the file. and it added the student that was just submitted by the user. If the user wanted to clear the student's file, we just wrote to the student's file with an empty string. So here's write students. Either we're going to write, here it is. Either we're going to write to the student's file with an empty string if there's no students in the student array, or we'll iterate over all the students and write them each to the file. So we did this in the case if we wanted to remove one student. So by removing one student, we removed it from the array of global students and then wrote the whole array to the file. Yes?
Line 75, can you use append file instead of PHP end of line?
Can you use append file on
or
here?
File append, file underscore append instead of that. PHP DOL. Will it still work?
File append, that's a flag for opening though, right?
That's for the file put contents.
No, you can use it. You can append content just like that is doing, right?
I'm not sure. Let's look it up. I don't know what that flag does, but let's look it up. So what's the flag called? Append file?
File
Yeah, it's
underscore
the same
append.
as just the A on the
File underscore append?
Yes, but usually we use it with file put contents.
Oh yes, so this is a flag for file put contents, not for writing. So remember, file put contents opens, writes, and closes the file in one shot.
Yeah, that's the same thing, right?
So what I'm doing here though is I'm writing. So I wouldn't be able to use file append in place of PHP end of line, because PHP end of line, all it does is it tells me if I'm using \n or \r\n when writing to a file.
But you could use file put content instead of what you have, f write and f close. And
Instead of all of this stuff.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
But you still need the end of line though.
Yeah.
To indicate that
Right.
you want to store it on a different line.
So we created a version of this using file put contents, I think, last week. And what we did was we constructed all the lines beforehand into a giant string and wrote it all in one shot. Okay. Okay, so any questions? Is it clear what we did last week? We're going to start modifying the process a little bit. Yes?
Is this stuff going to be on the lab test? The MySQL?
MySQL is not going to be on the lab test, no.
So today is the lab test or next?
Today is the lab test, yes. So today's lab test will be on writing to files. Okay, so if you have any questions about writing to files, let me know as we're going through. Okay. So what I want to do now is, let's talk about what we need to do to write to a database. So when writing to a file, the process is we want to open the file, get some sort of file handle from the operating system, and then read or write from the file using the handle. So connecting to a database is similar. We also use a handle or an object that represents our connection to the database. So the first thing we need to do is create a connection to the database. We need to know the address of our server, the credentials to connect to the database, and which database we're connecting to, the name of the database. So if I go back to the localhost MySQL phpMyAdmin, here it is. So these are all the different databases I have on this database server. So the one I want to connect to is called wk14. Okay? Good. So there are different ways to connect to a MySQL server. There's a procedural way and an object-oriented way. Since we haven't covered any classes or objects, what we'll do is we'll do the procedural way today. If you're interested, you can look up the object-oriented way on php.net. Okay, so like I said, the first thing we need to do is connect to our database. So I'm going to write a function called connect. Can you see that? Is that too small? Is that better? Okay, so we'll write a function called connect. So what connect does is it uses MySQLi connect to return a connection object that describes the database that we're talking to, similar to a file handle that we had last week with fopen. So what we'll do is call it con. I like to call it con. You can call it whatever you like. So use MySQLi, that's the library we're using. So MySQLi connect. Okay, where are we connecting? So we're connecting to localhost.
Otherwise, an IP address can go with it. Right?
Sorry?
Otherwise, an IP address can go with that.
That's right, yeah. So localhost is just a shortcut for 127.0.0.1. So the username that we're connecting on, so in this case it was Rafal, the password that you're connecting with, password, as well as the database that we'd like to connect to. So our database is called wk14. Okay? So This can succeed or fail based on a number of things. The address might be wrong, the username or password might be incorrect, and the database might be incorrect. So what we should do is we should check to see if there's an error number set after we try to connect. So the way we can do this is by calling MySQL connect error number. So that's what we're looking for. It's a function. So if this is greater than 0, that means there has been an error number set. What we want to do is die here. In production you shouldn't die, but just for now as we're learning how to use this, we'll die here and we'll output, let's say, connection error. Maybe which error number we got when we were trying to connect. So we'll call this MySQL error number again. This is useful if you want to look up which error occurred. So I'm just constructing the string here. And then maybe we want to have the error string. So MySQL connect error. Okay, so good. So that's all we need to connect. So at this point, it's up to you if you want to have connect as a global variable that you can access from everywhere, or if you want to call connect every time. So what we can do is we can just make connect a global variable or return it. So what I'll do is I'll return connect. And maybe we'll assign this to a global variable by calling it. A bit of a departure from last week. Okay, so let's try and call this and see if we get any errors. So I'm going to go back down to our main processing area. So instead of calling GetStudents right away, I'm going to call connect. Okay, so again, this is the function connect. It'll try to connect to MySQL using these credentials, this URL, and this week number, this database number. So let's see what happens. So I got to go to localhost. So here's 2144. Let's go back here. Let's save this as week 14 instead of 13b. Okay. And let's quickly modify the title here. So week 14 database. Okay, so let's go back and load the correct file here. So here's week 14. So I didn't get any connection errors. So it looks like the connection went through properly. Let's see what happens if I put something incorrect here. So let's go back to our connect function. I'm going to change localhost. Maybe I'll mistype localhost here. Let's see what happens if I try that. Okay, so here I get a warning. And then here is my die statement. So connection error 2002, PHP network get address. So there's no such host known. So this is an error that you might expect if you mistype the IP address. Let's try to trigger some more errors. So instead of localhost, let's try and log in with some invalid credentials. So maybe I mistyped password. Okay, so here I have an access denied for user Rafael at localhost using password yes. And let's mistype the database. So instead of week 14, let's undo that. Oops. Instead of week 14, let's try another database. Okay, so we get access denied. Here you can see all the credentials. So Rafael at localhost to database week for wk14. Okay, good. So we've successfully connected. Let's talk about how we can query the results. Okay, so connection is set. When we're calling this connection, let's say con equals connect. So instead of just saying global con, I'd like to return the connection in case we want to use this connection function elsewhere. And I'll define a global connection variable here. We don't need this student file. Let's delete it after that. Okay, so we have a connection string. Now let's modify GetStudents. So instead of reading the students file, what we want to do is read the stuff from the database. So without thinking of PHP, if I wanted to read all the students from the student table, what would I write into MySQL? Select star from students. Good. So basically what we need to do is use the connection to the database and write this with PHP. So I'm just going to modify the GetStudents function above the file stuff, and then we'll compare the difference. So I still need to use the global students array. Maybe I want to use the global connection array, connection object. And now what I want to do is, let's prepare the query that we want to execute. So someone said, select star from students. There's my query. Okay, what I want to do is I want to execute this query using my connection to MySQL. This will return a result set. So we call MySQLi query. As you might expect, similar to fwrite and fread. First we have to pass the connection or the handle that we're using to talk to the database, so in this case con, and then the query we'd like to execute. Okay? Good. This returns a result set, but it could return true or false. Sorry, it could not work successfully. So let's check the return value of result. Else, we'll do something else here. Okay. So let's assume for a second that the query goes through, and then we'll try and introduce some errors and see what they look like. So MySQLi query returns something called the result set. So it's an object that we use to communicate back and forth with MySQL. One of the things that we can do with this result set is fetch a row. So similar how we read from files line by line, we can read from the database row by row. By row I mean for each record that's returned from your query. So we'll have a similar while loop here. So here what we'll do is while row equals MySQLi fetch array. So fetch array returns us an array of results. So we're turning this table of values into an array of results. I'll show you how the array looks. And what are we fetching here? We're using the result. So what I'll do here, before I write them to the file, I'm just going to var dump the array to show you what the row looks like. And then based on how it looks, we'll decide what we want to do with it. So I'll do var dump row. Remember, I want to var dump so that it's readable. So I'm going to echo out a PRE tag here. We'll close the PRE tag.
Do you have to save it into an array or each?
I do, but first I want to show you how the structure looks.
Oh, okay.
And then we'll start saving it into the array. Yes, I do. So this var dump is just for debugging, just for us to see what's happening. And I'm going to die right at the end of this function. So I just want to show you what's happening when we call GetStudents. Okay, so again, here's my query, select star from students. I'm executing the query on this connection that I've defined earlier. This returns a result set from MySQL. One of the things I can do with the result set is to return an associative array that describes the row, or just an array. I'm going to dump each row. So based on my connection here, sorry, my table of students, I should get two results back. One John Doe 77.5 and one Jane Doe 75.5. So let's see what happens. I'm going to refresh this guy. So here we go. So this is my first row that I dumped. Here's my second row. So let's see what's going on. So remember I said I had John Doe 77.5. So using this fetch array, I can reference each one of these fields using either the key the field name as the key, so ID, first name, last name, or grade. So I have ID as the key, first name as the key, last name as the key, or grade as the key. Alternatively, I can just use a numerical index, which is defined by the order in which the fields are defined. So ID is 0, first name is 1, last name is 2, grade is 3. Okay, any questions about that representation? So this is sort of similar to what we did with the students array last week. So we said that first name was entry 0, last name was entry 1, and grade was entry 2. Yes?
How are you going to access the elements?
How am I going to access these elements?
$$ underscore post? No, right?
No, so row, if I show you the code, Row is what I'm dumping. So I already have access to it. So here it is, row. This is what I'm dumping.
Okay,
So what,
so row bracket 0 is going to be the first.
That's it.
So you just save it into an array for each time it goes to a loop, it just adds to the array.
that's it. So now, if I know that this is how the array looks, what I can do is I can just read the value at first name, last name, and grade, or I can read the value at 1, 2, and 3 and write it into my students array. So here, instead of, I'm going to remove this debugging information and remove this die statement. So instead of var dumping the row, what I can do is I can push into my students array whatever's in row 1, row 2, but I have to make an array out of it, right? So I can do array, row 1, row 2, and row 3. If you'd like to be a bit more descriptive, an alternative way of doing this is instead of using 1, you can say first name, you can say last name, and here it would be grade.
Wouldn't you need to use, you don't need to use the ID?
Yes, that's
Already an index, so you don't need it?
yeah. So we do need to use the ID. So
No, I mean, sorry, the ID number.
yeah, we do need to use the ID. So if we go back to how we were deleting students, last time we used the position in the array as the ID. So what we can do is we can continue that trend by, instead of just pushing the student into a random slot into the array, let's put it into the slot that's described by the ID. We're using the same numbering system from 0 to some number n. So instead of just pushing it to the end of the array, let's read the ID, so row at 0 or row at ID. Okay, so what this will do is, instead of starting with 0, 1, 2, 3, whatever ID I read from the database, that's the slot I put it into the array. So it's kind of like using a numbered array, like an associative array, where we have certain keys that are numeric, but they're not all set.
Well, why do you have 0 there? Or you're just showing two different ways?
Yeah, these are two different ways that are equivalent. So I showed you that at index 0 in the row, it shows me the ID. And I can also reference the same value using the ID key instead of the number 0. Okay, and again, they're defined in the order that they're defined in this table. So 0, 1, 2, 3. Okay? Good. Okay, so I'll comment this out here, and I'll say that this is an equivalent way. So whichever way you prefer, you can use that way. Okay, so let's assume for a second that there was an error. So I'd like to know what kind of error I had. So let's also do a die here, query error. And maybe I'd like to append here what the error was. So you can do MySQL error. You pass in the connection object that you're using. Okay, so now let's see if this works. So I'm populating the students array. Otherwise I die. I'm not returning anything, and I want to erase the old function. So here's the old function. We're going to erase it. Okay, so we're slowly replacing all of the functions. Let's see if this works. Let's go back to our week 14 example. So I'm going to refresh this guy. Okay, so now it successfully reads the stuff from the database, John Doe and Jane Doe. And to convince you that it's actually reading from the database, let's go back and change one of these values to Jason instead of John, and refresh this page so it reads Jason Doe. Okay? So hopefully it's not too crazy. Let's introduce some errors into our query. So instead of querying from students, let's misspell the students table and see what happens. So it gives me a query error. Week 14, this is the database. Dot students doesn't exist. So that's what you can expect if the table is written incorrectly. Maybe instead of star, if I want to select foo, which is a field that doesn't exist in students, unknown column foo in field list. Okay, and if I maybe mistype something like a SQL error, There's an error in MySQL syntax that will repeat what you're trying to do. Yes?
I'm just going to ask, like an application of this, can you make like a game and then pass the database, like the scores to that database?
Yes.
And then secure that way and can't be modified, like I had issues like last semester.
Yes, yes, yes. Absolutely. Okay, good. So we can read from the database. Let's save this. So let's start replacing the functionality now. What if I wanted to write to the database? Okay, so what SQL would I have to write to insert a record into my table?
You just said insert.
Good. Insert what? Insert into. Good. And then?
Values.
Good. So I can define the field list that I'm inserting over. So for example, ID, first name, last name, grade. Then I can use the values and say all the values. If I omit that field list, then I have to insert them all in order.
How can we adapt this to Blackboard?
Sorry?
How can we adapt this to Blackboard in our own accounts so we can post our own grades?
You'd have to have credential access. Someone would have to give you access to the database. It's a good question, though. Okay. So let's insert some values into the database. So let's go over our program. So in the past, what we've done is we've first read the students from the file, made an internal representation of the file, and then modified that internal representation and wrote it to the file if we needed to at the end. But if we're using a database, there's already a persistent representation there that we can query. So what we should do is, instead of reading the students first, we should first process any changes that are required, persist them into the database, and then read after we've made changes. Yes?
But you know, like, on the last week, how you showed us that this had tools, how you got to open and lock the file so you won't get corrupted if other users are trying to. Is it the same concept as this?
You can do locks with databases as well.
And you would advise to do that
If you're doing something that you have to, let's say, modify many tables in one request, then for sure. It's something called a transaction.
Yeah.
It's a bit beyond the scope of this course, but it's definitely possible, yeah. Okay, so, like I said, instead of processing the requests after we read students, what I want to do is process the requests, make the changes to the underlying database before I read the results back. Okay, so it's a bit of a different mentality here. So let's look at the first process request condition. So a new student is being created. So I don't have to change any of the form processing logic, but I do have to change this logic here. So remember, we use the ID that's stored in the database to put the student in a specific position inside the student's array. We can't do that here because we haven't written it to the database yet. So we don't know which ID it's going to be stored at. So instead of appending this to the student's array, I'm just going to delete this line. What we want to do is add a student to the database instead of appending a student to the file. After we add the student to the database, once we read all the students in that database, the student we just added will already be there. And we'll have the correct ID that's associated with that student. So let's go to append student. Here it is. I'm going to change this to add student. Okay, I'm passing in the student that I'd like to add. Okay, so this process is going to be slightly different. I'll leave this here just so you can compare. Okay, so just like before, I want to use the global connection object that I've defined earlier. Okay, this time the query that I want to write is insert into which table? Students. Which values? So ID, first name, last name, and grade. Good. And which values do I want to insert? So now there are two options. I can either construct the query using string concatenation. So I just blindly read the parameters from the input array and pass it into this string and execute this query. Okay, this is dangerous because what if someone has their first name put something like this. So instead of,
Drop database.
that's right,
Drop.
it's called a SQL injection attack. So as their first name, let's say this is null. As their first name, they put a semicolon, drop table students, and a comment after. So what will happen is we'll terminate this statement, then we'll drop all the students, and everything after is a comment. And they've just destroyed your all
Can
the
you
data
put
that
an
you've
statement
collected.
filtering that they can't put a semicolon?
Sorry?
What if you put like an statement before that and they can't put a semicolon?
Yeah, you could. You could.
Would that
So
fix it? Or,
that's one way to fix it.
but there's a better way.
There's a better way, which I'll tell you about right now. So the better way is called prepared statements. So what we do is, instead of writing the query using string concatenation, what we do is we create a prepared statement where we put question marks where we're expecting values from the user. And what this allows us to do is we define where the variables go. It strips out things like semicolons and SQL code. And it only allows a specific type. So for example, you can define that you're expecting a string, an integer, a float, or a double, or a blob, for example, which is just a collection of bits. So that's the generally accepted way to do this. And instead of just creating a string, what we do is we write a function called MySQL prepare. This is a prepared statement. We have to say which connection we're preparing the statement over. Maybe I'll put this on another line so it's a bit easier to read. Make sure you terminate the string and terminate the statement. Okay, so once again, all I'm looking for is the first name, last name, and the grade. Okay, so these question marks are what will be replaced. And how we replace them is we bind the parameters. So we use a function called MySQL st statement bind param. Okay, so this binds the parameters that we want to for this prepared statement. So the first argument to this function is which query or prepared statement are we using. The next argument is what variable types are we expecting. So in this case, we're expecting a string. This first question mark is going to be a string. This second question mark is going to be a string. The last question mark is going to be a double or a float. So this usually confuses students the most. Here what I'm going to do is just put SSD. So it's a bit kind of a weird argument because it's a string. But how you should look at this is every letter. Yes. Every letter describes one of the question marks. So the first S letter says the first question mark should be a string. The second S says the second question mark should be a string. And the D, the last character, says the last question mark should be a double. Okay, there's only four: S, D, I, or B. So primarily we'll be using S, D, and I. Okay, so we've defined how many parameters. So this string not only tells you which types, but how many parameters you have. And the following arguments are, what are those parameters? So the first string that we want to insert into this query is the student object that we passed in at index 0. So remember, I'm passing in a student object that I read from the post. The next argument is student1. So again, this is the first name, this is the last name, and the third one is student grade. So this is the second one. Okay, so let's go over this function one more time. Yes?
If you had 100 students, you wouldn't do that, right?
If you had 100
students to pass at that stage.
But here we're just passing one at a time.
Oh,
Yeah, each time you want to call a function.
okay. So let's say you have more than one.
So you just call the function twice with different students.
Is not student 0 is not ID? Is that actually first name?
No, because let's go back here. So in my post processing, so as I'm processing the post, the first entry in the student array is first name, last name, and grade.
And also before, you had the con variable.
Yes?
You declared it globally and made it null.
Yes?
Why did we make it null?
You don't have to.
Oh.
There you go.
But it has to be declared globally because it's within each function too, right?
You should declare global, yeah, because I'm using it as a global variable.
Right.
The alternative is to call connect every time and keep a reference somewhere.
If you say you put null, it's just saying like that's empty. Start
Yeah.
off empty.
Yeah, just out of habit. You can just leave it like this. Undefined and null, same thing. Okay. So, where was I? Here. Connect, get student, process request, format students, add student. This is where I was. Okay, so I wanted to bind the parameters. Okay, there's two things left. After I've created the query, I bound the parameters. So I have 3 parameters. You can tell that I have 3 parameters by 3 question marks, 3 characters describing what type of data I'm binding, and 3 variables after. So again, this question mark is a string that's defined by student 0. This question mark is a string that's defined by student 1. This question mark is a double that's defined by student 2. Okay? The next thing I do is execute the statement, MySQL stmt, execute. Okay, which statement am I executing? The query that I've just prepared. After we're done, you should clear, close the statement, just to free up any space that's reserved. Okay? So you can compare the difference between appending and adding to a student above and below there. Okay, so I'm going to erase the file away. Okay, we'll save this. Let's go back to our application. I'm going to refresh this guy. Hopefully there are no errors. Let's see if I can add a student. So I'm going to add Steve Smith with a grade of 88. We'll create this guy. So I've added him according to the application. Let's look at the database. If I refresh the database, I have a Steve Smith in here as well. Okay, so I'm successfully writing to the database now. Let's try Jason Jones, let's say 66. Create. Let's go to the database. It's there. Okay, let's change Jason Jones' grade to 99 instead. Okay, let's see if that changes anything here. It does. Okay. So quickly, there's not much time left. Let's do remove a specific student and remove all students. Okay, so again, if we wanted to remove a specific student, we created a link here that tells me which ID I'm removing. At the moment they line up, but as soon as I remove one of the students, I'm not going to reuse that ID over again. So what I'll do is, instead of using an ordered list, I'm going to use an unordered list in my format function. So here I'm going to use an unordered list. This is UL. Okay, let's go back to my remove a specific student. So I made 3 checks. Remember, I passed the ID of the student I want to remove. Last week I made 3 checks. I checked to see if remove was numeric. I checked to see if it was greater than or equal to 0. And I checked to see if is less than the count of students. Because remember, the ID referred to the index of the array in which the student was. But we're not reading the students before we call this. Remember, we're first processing the request, and then we're getting the students. So the students array isn't populated now. Moreover, the indices aren't related to the array anymore. They're related to the database. So I only need to perform 2 checks. If it's numeric and if it's greater than 0. Those are the only 2 things I need to know. I don't have to modify the internal array because I haven't read it yet. All I have to do is remove the student. So instead of calling write students, let's call remove student. So I'll call a different function. Which one do I want to remove? The one that's described by the ID remove. Okay. So this function is going to look very similar to the previous one. So I'm going to write it right beside it so you can see the similarities. So here it is. So here's add student. What I'm going to do is write remove student right under it. So let's do function. Maybe I can move this comment here. So add a student to the DB. Okay, we're going to write a function called remove student. It's going to take an ID as an argument. Okay, what's the query that I want to write if I wanted to remove a student without using PHP, just with MySQL? So I want to write delete from table name where condition. So our query should look like this: delete from which table name, students, where ID equals, and here again we want to pass in a value. So you have two choices again. You can play with string concatenation and try and handle all of the SQL injection attacks yourself, or you can do a prepared statement like before. And again, to create a prepared statement, we just do MySQL prepare. You pass in the connection that you want to prepare over, the statement. Okay, now we're going to bind the parameters. So MySQL stmt bind param. Okay, which query are we binding to? The query we just defined. And now what are we binding? We're binding one parameter, which is an integer that we're getting from the argument. So someone tell me how I can finish this query. What string should I pass after on line 91? I. Okay, so I'm passing one string I. Good. And then? ID. That's it. Exactly. So here I'm only binding one parameter. It's an integer, and it's the value that I passed in. Good. And then the last two things are exactly the same. Execute and close. Okay. Let's see if that works. So let's go back to our script. Hopefully no typos. Okay, Jason Jones. Let's remove Steve Smith. Oh, so a lot of typos here. Let's see what's going on. So just by looking, I know what I forgot to do. Can you tell me?
Can we see the errors?
So compare these two functions, add student and remove student. What am I missing?
Con.
Yeah, so con is not set. So I need to use global con. Good. So this should work. Let's go back. Okay, let's try to remove Steve Smith. He's done, gone. Let's check the database. Let's browse. Steve Smith is gone. Notice that I haven't reordered the indices. So if I add one more student, it's going to be at index 5, but I'll never reuse 3 again. This is why...
That's normal?
That's normal, yes.
It's also preferred not to do that?
Yes.
Is it? Okay. Is there any reason why?
Sorry?
Is there a reason why?
It's unique. For example, usually what we do is we make relationships in a database.
Yeah.
So imagine that you have a lot of structure around a specific record in the database that point to a specific ID. You remove that ID, if you replace that ID, all these values are going to point to that ID. Okay. Good, so we successfully removed a student. Let's add one more. Test. Let's say 66.5, create. So it works. All right, last thing I'll show you, and then we'll do the lab test. So let's say I wanted to remove all the students. How would I do that? Okay, so something like that. So I would have to delete from students. And remember, in deletion, it's the where clause that determines what we're deleting. So I can either have a where clause that's always true, and just say where true, or something like ID is greater than 0, which is always true anyway. So I want to erase everything, right? In this case, do I need to prepare a MySQL prepare statement? Am I passing anything into the query? No, it's always the same, right? So let's write that one very quickly. Where am I going to call it? Let's look at my post-processing. Here it is. If I want to clear the students file, or just remove all students, let's update these comments, remove all students. Instead of calling write students, I'm going to call remove students. Okay, let's go back to write students and see where it is. Here it is. So I'm going to call this one remove students. Okay. And I'll erase this guy over here. So let's define the query. So the query is delete from which table? Students. Okay, where? Let's say ID is greater than 0, which is always true. Okay, and all we have to do now is execute. So MySQL query over the connection object, this query, and here is my global connection object.
You don't need to delete asterisks to select like all? Or
No, because it's not like a select. Select, you say select which columns, but in delete, you say delete from which table, and this is the where clause. Okay, so it works just like this one, but the where selects everything. Okay, so let's see if remove students works. I'm just going to refresh the page here. We'll click clear, no students. Let's check the database. Browse, no students in the database. Okay, if we go back to here, let's make John Doe 23. Notice the ID of John now. I don't know if you can see it, it's 6. If we do Jane Doe, 66. And we go back to our database, we now have 2 entries, and notice the ID keeps incrementing. Okay, I know that was a bit quick. Mazir will go over this again during lecture, so hopefully you'll have some questions for him or for me if you have any now. But I'll post all of this online, and we'll do a lab test. Let me just stop the recording.
Just push on all